Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 203, January 27th to February 2nd, 1865. Last week we had some primary sources talking about conditions on the front, post some of the battles we've most recently fought. We got to see how things are going out in the Army of the Cumberland, what is left of that, in George Thomas's command, with correspondences from the 125th Ohio. And then we also saw what things are like with the South Carolina Brigade, McGowan South Carolina Brigade, in the defenses of Petersburg. This week, we will talk about Frederick Douglass. In some ways, I feel like it's overdue, as he has popped up in our story before. And with that, we should talk about the 13th Amendment as well. But prior to all that, let's see if we can check in on what is happening with William T. Sherman. Before we check in on Sherman, let's talk about our Patreon content. And of course, in the month of January here, we have done a movie review that was Gone with the Wind. So we talked about the historical accuracy of that film, classic film from 1939. We've done other movie reviews in the past. We've done memoir reviews, picture slideshows as well of modern day battlefields. And next month, coming in as we are about to be in February, we're actually going to do something a little bit different, very similar to a episode we did before, where actually we will be talking about some more statistics. So we did a statistical analysis not too far back, mostly focused around battlefield casualties and kind of comparing the effectiveness in terms of different generals and different battles, percentages, and I decided just to compile some other stats that I had found in my various sources and just kind of talk about those as well. So if that sounds like it would interest you, or any of the other things that I talked about sound like they would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now, it's been a while since we talked about Comp Sherman and his army. They had moved through Georgia, facing very little opposition, and were now hanging out in Savannah. Despite having foraged liberally from the countryside, getting to Savannah was an issue, and one that saw supply dwindling. A more concentrated effort before that city might have been a disaster for the Union, but there are certainly a lot of what-ifs in that scenario. The mayor of Savannah, amongst other prominent citizens, would beseech Sherman not to burn their town, but Sherman was not for such action. This is often a counter-argument to the total war aspect of his campaign. Not every home was burned, and not everything was destroyed. Sherman was at least sympathetic to the Southern people in many cases, and was really only interested in ending their war capability. Part of that included, yes, the destruction of supply and shelter. While some troops relished in the activity, some did not. So there really was a mixed bag. We've talked about this before, where Sherman is more interested in destroying these targets, these places, because he really needs the soldiers who are fighting abroad in Georgia to really start to give up and really understand that war has come to their country. We mentioned very briefly, I think in the March to the Sea, how Georgia was kind of unprepared for him to just march through, because, and we can also probably relate to this. This is one of these things that I think might be a connection between the past and the present, and that it's probably hard to really think about a enemy army marching through your backyard, right? Like, you probably would not really know what to do, or really not be believing that kind of thing could happen. And it's been a long time since the Revolution, the War of 1812. It hasn't been that long, right? There's still individuals who might have remembered those battles, those engagements, the fact that the Brits were in Washington, burned the White House, right, at the time. So it's not too far-fetched for them maybe to think, but it's been a long time, and people tend to forget. So there's not really any kind of concept of a foreign army marching through. And kind of case in point, the Georgians are unprepared when Sherman actually does it. While in Savannah, Sherman would be visited by Edwin Stanton, and there would be an inquiry into a particular event on the march, which I think ties into our story today very well. A side effect of the march was that a large amount of formerly enslaved families would become attached to the moving columns. In some instances, the white families as well would follow their conquerors for protection from additional roving bands of Federals or even Confederates. Joe Wheeler still had his cavalry, troopers who would actually take from the populace as well and execute the skulkers trying to profit off the land. We highlighted in a previous episode that there was at least limited action on part of the Confederate cavalry to harass the Union armies and Kilpatrick's troopers. While these efforts were unsuccessful, Stanton was interested in one event in particular. In this instance, Jefferson C. Davis had his column moving across a creek via pontoon. Wheeler and his cavalry would press, meaning that Davis ordered the pontoon removed to protect his rear. While this might not have been an issue in other campaigns, during the march to the sea, it would mean that a large amount of refugees would be trapped on the other side of the creek. Many who attempted to cross were drowned, some helped by sympathetic soldiers. Confederates fired into the blue column as well as the mass of formerly enslaved, capturing many and returning them to servitude. Some Union soldiers grew appalled. In fact, you see in many first-hand accounts that while they did not have epiphanies, so to speak, and completely turned their ways around when it came to racism, they did start to understand the need for emancipation, where otherwise they were against it. Seeing is believing in some cases, and these soldiers were definitely seeing the brutalities of slavery. Will Sherman, who was not a fan of using black soldiers, would be looked into for this incident. His legacy is complicated when it comes to Georgia, and is also complicated for his views on this subject. Davis was not seen having done anything wrong, the already controversial general arguing that he was doing what was necessary to safeguard his troops. Remember that Jefferson C. Davis actually murders Bull Nelson in cold blood in Louisville, but because the Union Army needs officers, they need officers with experience, he's allowed just to kind of get away with it. He literally commits murder and gets away with it. So there are some who think, hey, let's probably like revisit this and see, maybe we can try him for murder. But it's just so far in the past now that it's just not going to happen. But definitely there are those who are not big fans of Jefferson C. Davis. Sherman would be irritated by the incident, pointing out that he had brought many thousands to Savannah. While this is true, Sherman would plan to try to make sure that they would not continue to follow him with future campaigning. He would come up with a proposal that would be known as 40 acres and a mule. Those who had accompanied him would receive acreage on the Georgia coast, giving them their land to cultivate. While the motives for the federal general may be a little shaky, this will be giving the Sea Islands over from confiscated southern land formerly owned by those who supported the Confederacy. It would be the first time in which there would be a reparation or redistribution of land for the formerly enslaved. While much of the land would be reclaimed and the federal government would not uphold this promise, it is interesting that it comes from such a figure as Sherman. Here we have his Special Orders 15. Headquarters Military Division of the Mississippi, in the field of Savannah, Georgia, January 16, 1865. The islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. 2. At Beaufort, Hilton Head, Savannah, Fernandina, St. Augustine, and Jacksonville, the blacks may remain in their chosen or accustomed vocations, but on the islands and in the settlements hereafter to be established, no white person whatever, unless military officers and soldiers detailed for duty, will be permitted to reside, and the sole and exclusive management of affairs will be left to the freed people themselves, subject only to the United States military authority and the acts of Congress. By the laws of war and orders of the President of the United States, the Negro is free and must be dealt with as such. He cannot be subjected to conscription or forced military service, save by the written orders of the highest military authority of the Department, under such regulations as the President or Congress may prescribe. Domestic servants, blacksmiths, carpenters, and other mechanics will be free to select their own work and residence, but the young and able-bodied Negroes must be encouraged to enlist as soldiers in the service of the United States, to contribute their share toward maintaining their own freedom and securing their rights as citizens of the United States. Negroes so established will be organized into companies, battalions, and regiments under the orders of the United States military authorities, and will be paid, fed, and clothed according to law. The bounties paid on enlistment may, with the consent of the recruit, go to assist his family and settlement in procuring agricultural implements seeds, tools, boats, clothing, and other articles necessary for their livelihood. It's actually kind of interesting when you read Article 2 and then you compare it to what Patrick Cleburne suggested there at the beginning of 1864. He had that proposition, and it is actually very similar in the sense of like, hey, if we provide these individuals with these land, they can actually have that go toward their families, and then they could serve in the army for us. So it is a very strange parallel that these are very similar, I think, in terms of concept and wording. Now, it's probably questionable whether, in Cleburne's case, they would have been citizens of the United States, citizens of the Confederate States of America. That's questionable. However, it probably would have been some kind of abbreviated form of that, so not quite the same, but some of the verbiage is actually, I think, kind of striking in that it is very similar. 3. Whenever 3 respectable Negroes, heads of families, shall desire to settle on land, and shall have selected for that purpose on island, or locality clearly defined within the limits above designed, the inspector of settlements and plantations will himself, or by such subordinate officer as he may appoint, give them a license to settle such island or district, and afford them such assistance as he can be, enable them to establish a peaceable agricultural settlement. The 3 parties named will subdivide the land, under the supervision of the inspector, among themselves and such others as may choose to settle near them, so that each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, and when it borders on some water channel, will not more than 800 feet from waterfront, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. The quartermaster may, on the requisition of the inspector of settlements and plantations, place at the disposal of the inspector one or more of the captured steamers to ply between the settlements, and one or more of the commercial points heretofore named in orders, to afford the settlers the opportunity to supply their necessary wants and to settle the products of their land and labor. 4. Whenever a Negro has enlisted in the military service of the United States, he may locate his family in any one of the settlements at pleasure and acquire a homestead and all the rights and privileges of a settler as though present in person. In like manner, Negroes may settle their families and engage on board the gunboats or in fishing or in the navigation of the inland waters, without losing any claim to land or other advantages derived from this system. But no one, unless an actual settler, as above defined, or unless absent on government service, will be entitled to claim any right to land or property in any settlement by virtue of these orders. 5. In order to carry out the system of settlement, a general officer will be detailed as inspector of settlements and plantations, whose duty it shall be to visit the settlements, to regulate their police and general management, and who will furnish personally to each head of family, subject to the approval of the United States, a possessory title in writing, giving as near as possible the description of boundaries, and who shall adjust all claims or conflicts that may arise under the same, subject to the like approval, treating such titles altogether as possessory. The same general officer will be charged with the enlistment and organization of the Negro recruits and protecting their interests while absent from their settlements, and will be governed by the rules and regulations prescribed by the War Department for such purpose. 6. Brigadier General R. Saxton is hereby appointed Inspector of Settlements and Plantations and will at once enter on the performance of his duties. No change is intended or desired in the settlement now on Beaufort Island, nor will any right to property heretofore acquired be affected thereby, by order of Major General William T. Sherman. So very interesting terms in which William T. Sherman is actually laying out, and it's not going to be the last time that he's kind of invoking some congressional authority here. He kind of sort of crosses the line between what's a military and a state sort of affair, shall we say. So he actually is not going to be able to enforce this. And we mentioned how the federal government is not going to uphold this, so it's not going to be the first time. But his primary goal, right? And it's not to say that Sherman is entirely a bad guy. I think sometimes he gets painted like that. But his primary goal is to make sure that they are going somewhere, right? So they're not going to continue to follow his army. He has his eyes set on the Carolinas. He doesn't want a whole lot of camp followers in that instance either. It's going to be a liability when he gets into those states. So obviously he has to come up with an idea, and it's actually fairly generous of an idea here. On January 31st, we have the U.S. House passing the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. The amendment would read, Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And 2. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, it may surprise you to see a short amount of words, and for what was a momentous occasion in the country's history. This is the point that has been the main focus of conflict, and it has finally been resolved. But it may also surprise you to know that there was at least some opposition. Several Democrats would argue against the amendment, but Lincoln was able to gather enough support, urging Seward, amongst others, to pull some strings. As an election had recently occurred, Lincoln also rushed to get it through Congress, without any others who might have voted no could take office. So remember, in this election, there probably would have been more individuals who would have been more on the side of, say, the Peace Democrats coming in. So they might have said no to this particular amendment. So Lincoln is trying to get it through Congress before that happens. While it is a big occasion, ending slavery and other forms of bondage, it was very far from the end. The reason why we have highlighted Sherman's efforts today is that while there was freedom, aid in terms of land and jobs was something else that was going to be necessary. This is exactly what Sherman had tried to accomplish in a roundabout way, but unfortunately, in many ways, slavery would continue for a period of time in the South, especially before the government started to move on enforcement of the amendment. So this seems like a good time to maybe talk about Frederick Douglass. Now, Douglass we might have mentioned before, but we truly have not had a segment on him. So I think it's about time. Douglass was born in 1818 and lived his early life in servitude in Maryland's Eastern Shore. Possibly the offspring of his mother's master, he would be separated from his immediate family at an early age. He would fall in love with a free woman living in Baltimore who would help him escape in 1838. Giving him a sailor's uniform to wear, Douglass would jump on a northbound train heading to New York. Once free, he would marry Anna Murray, the woman who had helped him. Anna would die in the 1880s, and Frederick would actually remarry a white abolitionist, Helen Pitts. From his first marriage, he would have 5 children, one of which would serve in the 54th Massachusetts, as we have mentioned. Early in life, he would settle in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was a good spot to be because it was a very large abolitionist community. This is, of course, where Douglass meets William Lloyd Garrison, who you might remember we talked about all the way back in the beginning episodes. It is also here where he will write his autobiography. He will actually continue to work on that, adding as his life went forward. It is during this time that he would become heavily involved in the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. He would continue to write and become a famous orator. During the Civil War, he would actually confer with Lincoln on black troops and the freeing of the enslaved in the South during periods of federal occupation. He would become the first African American nominated for vice president after the war. During these later years, Douglass will continue to lobby for the rights of women to vote as well. Under Rutherford B. Hayes, he would become U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. While his former master lay dying, he would visit and reconcile with him as well as his daughter, previously Frederick having sent him a letter. Douglass would die of a heart attack in 1895. Now, he would have a complicated relationship with America and Lincoln, and understandably so. He would often say how he had no country. Upon the revealing of the Emancipation Monument, showing Lincoln above a black man, he would take to the podium and give a speech that we will close out with today. It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. In all his education and feeling, he was an American of the Americans. He came into the presidential chair upon one principle alone, namely opposition to the extension of slavery. His arguments in furtherance of this policy had their motive and mainspring in this patriotic devotion to the interests of his own race. To protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed, Abraham Lincoln was not less ready than any other president to draw the sword of the nation. He was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master, and to suppress a slave uprising for liberty, though his guilty master were already in the arms against the government. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my fellow white citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. First, midst, and last, you and yours were the objects of his deepest affection, and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. To you, it especially belongs to sound his praises, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply his statues, to hang his pictures of high upon your walls, and commend his example. For to you he was a great and glorious friend and benefactor. Instead of supplanting you at his altar, we would exhort you to build high his monuments. Let them be of the most costly material, of the most cunning workmanship. Let their forms be symmetrical, beautiful, and perfect. Let their bases be upon solid rocks, and their summits lean against the unchanging blue, overhanging sky, and let them endure forever. But while in the abundance of your wealth and in the fullness of your just and patriotic devotion, you do all this, we entreat you to despise not the humble offering we this day unveil to view. For while Abraham Lincoln saved you a country, he delivered us from bondage. According to Jefferson, 1 hour of which was worse than ages of the oppression your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose. I have said that President Lincoln was a white man, and shared the prejudices common to his countrymen toward the colored race. Look back to his times and to the condition of his country. We are compelled to admit that his unfriendly feeling on his part may be safely set down as one element of his wonderful success in organizing the loyal American people for the tremendous conflict before them, and bringing them safely through that conflict. His great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin, and second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To do one or the other or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and the powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Without this primary and essential condition to success, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people, and rendered resistance to the rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as his statements to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Though Mr. Lincoln shared the prejudices of his fellow white countrymen against the Negro, it is hardly necessary to say that in his heart of hearts he loathed and hated slavery. The man who could say fondly, "Do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war shall soon pass away, yet if God wills it to continue, all the wealth piled by 200 years of bondage shall have been wasted, and each drop of blood drawn by the lash shall have been paid for one drawn by the sword. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether," gives all needed proof of his feelings on the subject of slavery. He was willing, while the South was loyal, that it should have its pound of flesh, because he thought that it was so nominated in the bond. But farther than this, no earthly power could make him go. So there we have Frederick Douglass on this address, in particular talking about Abraham Lincoln, and he kind of has a point. It's kind of fair if you're looking at it from his perspective, how in the beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln is trying to keep the country together. You can't just run in there and just kick down the doors and say, here's what we're doing. That's not going to fly. All right? There were enough people in the North who weren't going to be about that. Once it became a war necessity, then you're able to add that secondary goal. But the primary goal has always been preservation of the Union, right? And Frederick Douglass points that out. He talks about how he's not going to win any favors. He's not going to have anybody to actually put down the rebellion if the goals are reversed. I think it is a little unfair, though, of a criticism, right? Perhaps this speech can actually be thrown more into a modern lens, and there's probably more people in the modern day that probably would have agreed with him now. But you got to feel for a guy like Abraham Lincoln who comes on board. He says, hey, I don't have any kind of authority to do this. And even if that is his political stance, is, emancipation is the ending of slavery, at least while everybody is in the Union, if it's in law, he doesn't really have any right to change that. And that he points that out in his initial inauguration. Now, the South is not going to listen to that. They're going to panic because it is somebody who is not a big fan of slavery, who doesn't want slavery to continue. And Frederick Douglass will talk about that in his speech as well. He mentions how, he says he comes on board and he's like, hey, I'm going to try to limit the ability for there to be continued slave states. Well, if you are the Confederate States of America, if you are at that point still in the Union, you're the South, then you are seeing that as something that's going to just get you to the vote, right? Get to the legal precedent of being able to abolish slavery. Because if you continue to have these territories in the North, the kind of the compromise that we had before is that we're having additional slave territory, shall we say, in the South. So if you have that, then it's always equal numbers. You're not going to be able to have a majority either way. Well, Lincoln, by saying, hey, we're going to make sure at least the southern part doesn't happen, but if we're going to continue to expand and make territories, make states, then yeah, that's going to make you a little bit jarred. If your entire way of life is built around the institution, then yeah, the southern states are going to rebel in that case. So you can kind of see it from that perspective. So in a way, I don't think it's necessarily fair to be like, you didn't do enough and you were just trying to make sure that the country was held together, because at least until you had to get to the part, and I think Frederick Douglass actually alludes to this in his speech, you have to get to the part where there's actually war to do anything about it, because once they leave the Union, then that makes it easier. And once you get to the point, even I would even argue in the war, where you're not going to come to a speedy, peaceful conclusion, right? There's going to be no compromises. Once you've passed that point, then obviously that becomes easier as well. We saw that 1862, probably around the 7 days battles, we know that the war is going to last, for at least another year or 2 years, right? Before it's actually going to come to a conclusion. That's really, a lot of people like to say First Manassas is where we're not going to be home by Christmas. It's going to be a long war. Well, I would sort of argue that once you get into 1862, you have a pretty fierce battle at Shiloh. You have your 7 days, Second Manassas, the invasion into Maryland, Antietam, and that's when very truly, the war is not going to end soon, either side, really. But I think it is interesting to read this speech out loud and really kind of go through the points. It's a little bit of a different speech, probably not maybe what people were expecting him to come with in terms of a commemoration to a monument. But if you actually look at the monument, and hopefully I'll include a picture here on the website. If you actually look at the monument, there probably is a little bit of room for gripe if you are Frederick Douglass. So that's another point to make as well. So we're going to bring everything to a close right there. We checked in on what is happening with Sherman and Savannah during his non-campaign season, passed the 13th Amendment, and talked more in depth on Frederick Douglass. Next week, we're going to return to action around Petersburg with the Battle of Hatcher's Run and talk about the Hampton Roads Peace Conference. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.